Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with New York City-based jazz drummer Jason Tiemann. He opened up about his first solo album, 2020's CD called Tiemann. Originally from Tampa, Florida, he moved to Kentucky, and then he went on to New York City, where he maintains a busy schedule as a freelance performer and educator. He's been influenced by the likes of Philly Joe Jones, Tony Williams, Elvin Jones, and Billy Higgins, and these days he is currently on the jazz faculty of the Jackie McLean Institute of Jazz at the University of Hartford. Over his celebrated jazz walk, he has performed or recorded with Benny Golson, David Liebman, Harold Mabern, Eric Alexander, Slide Hampton, and so many others on the New York City scene. So please get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Jason, thank you for taking a minute out for Neon Jazz today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Joe.
Your latest CD, Tiemann, talk to me about this project. What was your vision for this CD?
It was going to be my first recording as a leader. You know, I've played on innumerable records as a sideman over the years, but this was my first record as a leader. Originally the instrumentation was not going to be the Hammond organ trio with the guitar. I had another person lined up, a very famous jazz name. I don't want to mention it necessarily right now, but it was going to be a quartet record with traditional acoustic bass and that sort of thing. For whatever reason, my budget, I did this on my own, so I established my own record label and all that kind of stuff. My budget wasn't big enough to handle, a large group, so I decided, I thought I could kill two birds with one stone. I could get harmony and bass covered with the Hammond organ and then have a guitar player play the lead role. So after that, over the course of about a year, I wrote several original tunes for that particular instrumentation and just rounded it out for with some standards. I put one standard on there, I think, and then some other tunes that were by other famous jazz composers. So in a nutshell, that was it. That was the idea. I just wanted to get something out with my name as a leader, and that's how it happened. So
obviously you've been a sideman, you've been doing this for a while, you've been comfortable with it. Now stepping out into your own, are you happy with what you're giving the listener? Is this something that you envision?
It exceeds my vision, honestly. I knew it was going to be good with the musicians that I chose, which are the great Ed Cherry on guitar, who spent many years playing with Dizzy Gillespie, and then Kyle Kohler on the Hammond organ. I knew that the unit was going to be a strong, presentable unit, but I didn't realize that the recording was going to come out as nicely as it did. I'm very excited and happy about it. I've gotten a lot of other really great feedback from other musicians in the New York City area, and of course the radio stations have gone crazy with it. They all seem to love it. So yeah.
It seems to me before you went to New York, doesn't say specifically you have Midwest roots. So talk to me a little bit about born and raised and how you got into jazz.
Yeah, let's see. I was born in Tampa, Florida, and I lived there until about 1982, and which point my family and I moved to Louisville, Kentucky, because my father was pursuing a graduate degree in church music. He was a director of music in a church at the time, and my mother was a piano player, and she not only played piano for the church, choir and that sort of thing, but she taught piano lessons. So it was a musical environment. After we lived in Louisville, Kentucky for a few years, my dad finished his schooling. Then we ended up in Western Kentucky for many years. That's where I went to. Those were my formative years in high school, Owensboro, Kentucky to be exact. And then I ended up in Lexington, Kentucky I studied music at the University of Kentucky. And my wife her family, who I met at school, was from Louisville. She was also a music student at the time. We just planted in Louisville with the intention of, we'll just kind of get our feet on the ground. And then the idea was that we were going to move to New York so that I could, further my career in that way. Well, then just a couple of years ago, as a lot of couples do, that children started appearing. And then we ended up with 3 children. And so at the time, I thought I was kind of just going to be stuck in the Midwest for the rest of my life. Meanwhile, she was encouraging me the whole time to move to New York and to pursue my career there. I was getting a lot of other feedback from other musicians that I had met from the New York area through my association with the Jamie Aebersold Summer Jazz Workshops. And for those of you out listening who might not know what that is, that's the Summer Jazz Workshops are it's an educational program where people come from all over the world, and they study with world-class musicians and learn how to play in a combo setting. Anyways, a lot of the musicians from that group, namely Eric Alexander, David Hazeltine, Jim Snydero, the great trombonist Steve Davis, just to mention a few, were always telling me that I needed to get up to New York because obviously they were hearing something in my playing, and the one person that wasn't believing it though was me the whole time. And I would go back home and tell my wife, and she's like, "See, I told you." And the next thing you know, I would be in that cycle of depression of thinking that I'm never getting out of here, and also the idea of moving a family to New York City and the amount of income that it would require to sustain a life that we were already having down there. Anyway, so fast forward about 12 years, 13 years, my wife got a job offer at a private school in Manhattan, and it just so happened that it was enough that we could then move up. So that was almost 7 years ago. We've moved, reestablished myself in the New York City area, and the rest is kind of history, so they say.
Right on. So your influences are Philly Joe Jones, Tony Williams, Elvin Jones, Billy Higgins. What is it about their sound? What was it about them that inspired you so much?
Those are just a few of the main influences out there. I mean, of course, the list is long. There's a lot of other drummers that fall into that category. I don't know. Those particular guys just happened to catch me at just the right time in my development. I got one of my first records that I remember owning was a Impulse box set. It was called The Drums, and it was basically a chronological array of all of the greatest jazz drummers throughout history, starting with Warren Baby Dodds, and then it went all the way up to the 70s with Paul Motion. So I got to hear little snippets of those guys that play on, that recording, with the exception, I don't think Tony Williams was on there. There was something about the time feel that they had, their sound concept. I think a lot of drummers kind of take little bits and pieces from a lot of guys. For me, those are the guys that the saying, "You are what you eat." I transcribed and I studied each one of those guys extensively, and parts of their musical personalities kind of crept into my musical personality, and it came out in a different way. For example, I don't play I don't sound like Elvin Jones when I play. I don't sound necessarily like Philly Joe Jones or Tony Williams, but all of those guys put together, smashed into a ball, is hopefully the musical identity that surfaces through all of my study. So let's get back to New York. When you actually got there and you got involved, how hard was it for you to really get traction and start getting into that scene? There are innumerable outstanding musicians for practically every instrument in New York City. It's kind of the jazz mecca, so to speak. But one advantage that I had is that I had been developing relationships with the guys that I had mentioned earlier that I met from the Jamie Aebersold Summer Jazz Workshops. And those guys were the first guys that really started, plugging me in on different gigs here and there. And because of that, it opened up the doors to meet other musicians that were already well established, rather than, say, for example, moving to New York City when I was in my early 20s and not really knowing anybody. It was that really, really helped get my feet on the ground. For example, David Hazeltine, we had scheduled our move-in date at some point. Let's just say it was June the 10th. And David called me when we were getting ready for our move, and he said, "Can you be here May 27th for a gig?" And it so happened that it was going to be a really, really important gig for me, in that the lineup on that particular gig, it was at a very famous club in the city called Smoke. The lineup was David Hazeltine was the leader. Eric Alexander was the tenor saxophone player. Peter Bernstein played the guitar. The great John Weber on the bass. And that very night, who's who of all of the music, the jazz scene, somehow showed up to the gig. And I was so nervous, I almost didn't think I was going to be able to make it. But somehow, you get through those kind of situations and you persevere and you become stronger. Next thing I know, the great George Coleman is sitting next to me, next to the drums. If for those who've never been in the club before, the drums are kind of sitting, perpendicular to the edge of the stage. And by the second set, Eric Alexander was handing George his horn to play. So he's sitting next to me playing. Next thing you know, he's escorting George Coleman onto the bandstand, and there's other people showing up. Like I think Eric Reed showed up. There's the great pianist. Who else showed up? I think Jason Brown, another great drummer on the scene, stopped by and was there for a little while. So it was a really, really important opportunity. But it was because of those associations that then other people started recognizing my name. For example, Eric Alexander hooked me up with Mike LaDon, and I started come down and sitting in with his organ group at Smoke on Tuesday nights. And next thing you know, LaDon's calling me for gigs when Joe Farnsworth couldn't make it. So that was another powerful one. Eric also, he was incredibly influential in hooking me up with and Joe Farnsworth for that matter, hooked me up with gigs with the late great, I should say, Harold Mabern. So yeah, that first it was almost kind of like a sugar rush because you get a lot of action out of it immediately, and then it dies off and you realize, wow, I'm still down in the trenches and I've got a lot of work to do and getting around making it to gigs and showing my face as much as possible. But yeah, there's a lot of that in the city, a lot of that you kind of have to go through in order to get there. And, I'm not going to say that I've arrived at any point necessarily, but, it's certainly my calendar stays busy and I'm making a living and supporting my family. So that's the important thing.
What was the first live jazz show you saw that really blew your doors down?
That's a good question because, in rural Western Kentucky, there were not that many opportunities to go see live music at all. I'm trying to think, legendary performers. One that I got to see when I was in my 20s already was the great Elvin Jones. I got to see him play live, and I sat right in front of him, and that was a relatively powerful experience. Who else? I'm trying to think. I got to see Roy Haynes a few times when I was up and coming, young. I mean, most of my learning did not come from getting to witness it on the bandstand. It was mostly from recordings from either LPs or CDs or even tapes.
So you've obviously dedicated your life to jazz as an educator and a performer. What do you like best about this, day job that you have?
Well, it's all tied together. So I don't look at it as a day job necessarily. All of my teaching, recording, composing, performing is all one job. What do I like best about it? I think that one of the perks is that you get to experience growth all the time because there's always people that are throwing a lot of music at you to learn for this gig or that gig or a recording. Or one of the other perks is getting to maybe travel and see parts of the world that you would not necessarily have gotten to do. So, maybe, certain places in South America or, as far as like New Delhi, India, and experience cultures and people from different geographical locations. That's always one of the perks. Musicians that do what I do, and there are a lot of us out there. Not even in New York. I mean, they're all over the place. One of the big disadvantages of the life form or the life choice is that the amount of sleep that you really lose. The logistics of traveling can be a little bit of a headache sometimes. Keeping track of your calendar. Those are all things. And plus, on top of all that, if you're a parent, those are your first responsibilities. So. But yeah, I mean, I think getting to see new places and the feeling of constantly growing is one of the biggest perks for me.
Everyone has their perception of you, your family, your friends, students, fans, but you're living your life. Who do you think you are?
I'm a dad. I'm a husband. You know, those are the first things. I don't. The music, I try to make as secondary to that as possible. You know, when I'm home, I try to be home and to do a good job raising my family. That's who I am at deep down. You know, it just happens that I play the music, and I'm lucky enough to be playing it with a really high level of musicians out there in the universe doing it.
That's a great answer. It's a great way to wrap everything up. Hey, thank you for taking a little time out today for Neon Jazz, man. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest cats in New York, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Jason for his time, stories, and cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz all the time, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.